Hi everyone, and welcome back to our book review discussion. We've taken a week out from looking into our book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Because it was International Women's Week, which was a deeply difficult week for a lot of us as it crossed over with the vigil for Sarah Everard. So it has been a hugely important time for reflecting on women's rights, a hugely emotional time for us reflecting on our own experiences as women. If you are interested in us discussing that, we have a discussion on for International Women's Day that is on our YouTube channel. So do have a look at the female members of the BTV team talking about their experiences as women and how our reactions to what happened to Sarah Everard. So today, Kate and I will be discussing chapters 2 and 3. We both had a little bit of difficulty understanding exactly what Lila was saying in chapters 2 and 3. Kate, what's your sort of first response?
I thought that a lot of information, quite shocking information, was thrown across in both chapters, and it wasn't very clear what kind of point was trying to be made with it. I found, particularly in chapter 3, when there were a lot of excerpts from other books which were quite horrific, showing kind of, discussing sexual harassment within families, and I found it quite disturbing, and a lack of clear connection between what the author was trying to say really with all of these graphic details that were passed across. And even in chapter 2, a lot of it was about, the speech made by Laura Bush, and I just found, again, not much connection between the content and what the author was actually trying to say with it.
Yeah, similarly, I found chapter 3 very harrowing, where she lists case after case of awful atrocities committed against women in the Middle East. She talks about instances of marital rape, forced marriage, incest, honor killings. She concludes with how she is going to later talk about honor killings more. And what is confusing, as you said, in chapter 2, she starts with Laura Bush's speech, which was about going to war for women globally. And she's constantly making this point that there is an obsession, an unhealthy obsession with women's rights issues in the Orient, and that it is a new sort of form of Orientalism and colonialism of Western women caring more and being more involved in the issues of women in the Orient than in their own homes. But she simply gave the opposite effect by reading case after case after case. Yes, she was making the point that look how much is being written, look how many authors have written on these issues. This author wrote about this awful thing that happened, and this author wrote about this awful thing that happened. And she discredits a couple of the authors, and she talks about one of the cases not necessarily being true. But the overall effect actually is you come away from that chapter being shocked and upset and thinking there is a huge issue of domestic violence, polygamy, honor-related crime. And so then that inspired me to look into the statistics. So when we look at women being killed by intimate partners or other family members, in 2017 globally there was 50,000, and that breaks down into Asia, which is including the Middle East, 20,000, Africa 19,000, and Europe 3,000. So it did make me look into the statistics and come away realizing that, well, with intimate partner killings, so typically known as femicides and in some cases honor crime, that is significantly greater outside of Europe. So I almost think she ends up supporting the point that there does need to be an emphasis on doing something to curtail these issues, rather than the point that I think she's trying to make, that we should be dealing with our issues sort of in our own backyards first, and that our interest is some sort of distraction from our own problems and some sort of self-gratifying colonialism.
I also think it's quite interesting how you said that there is this kind of lack of statistics that she uses to back up her arguments. There's no real kind of support of the evidence behind what she seems to be directing her arguments towards. And then in chapter 3, when she tries to give these extracts of books, which are quite horrific, she's trying to kind of make the point that you can't just have one woman's experience and say that this is what Islam is about, or this is what Muslim cultures are about, or any Middle Eastern culture is about. But then she seems to be kind of using the same sort of style to suggest her own arguments. You know, when she says, you know, here's this speech, and then that kind of is her argument for there's we should be looking in our own backyards first, and Muslim women have been used in a really bad way. And it seems that she's trying to discredit a lot of the rhetoric around the so-called oppression of Muslim women, but then she does it using the exact same methods in her own work.
Yes, she has us then read all of these accounts.
Yeah, and I think it would probably, she could benefit from a lot more structure in her work if there is, you know, if she's trying to make the point that there's a manipulation of the image of the Muslim woman, which she appears to be doing in chapter 3, when she talks about, you know, 19th century portrayals of women as over-sexualized in harems, and then in the 20th and the 21st century as in very oppressed and, you know, never seen and shrouded in cloaks. And it just seems that she could use a bit more structure, and she could use actual statistics, as you've gone away and found, to back up the evidence that she's making.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's not wrong in saying that the oppression of Muslim women in countries where the West has been interested in intervening, so Iraq and Afghanistan, these issues have been used for propaganda to an extent and have been politicized. However, I cannot agree that they're the reasons that we went for war. However, it has been convenient to use these issues to garner support for war. If she'd made that nuanced point and then backed it up with the amount of coverage, without going into all of the details, but the amount of coverage of women's issues, coupled with then the increased sympathy that created in the populace for the war, she could have made a very strong point that it's been politicized and used for the wrong reasons. But she doesn't. She makes this huge claim that we went to war for these reasons, which is simply false, and then doesn't talk about any of the benefits. In fact, she almost poo-poos the benefits of global women's rights initiatives. She sees them as a colonial endeavor that is part of what she calls the new common sense, that I can sense, although she's not particularly clear, I can sense that this is not something she agrees with. But I then took some time to look at what are the key global initiatives, conventions for protecting women. What is global women's rights when we look at the UN and the legislation? And the main one is CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. It's, I would say, a very strong convention in that it aims to eliminate all violence. First of all, it aims to create complete equality between men and women. That is in employment, in pay, in education, in politics. But it goes further. It even discusses elimination of gender roles that it sees as leading to inequality. And that has caused issues in certain countries. And from my experience living and working in Palestine, there were regular protests against Sedor by an Islamist organization called the Hizb ut-Tahrir. And they regularly protest against women's rights initiatives. And what's scary is they speak the same language as our author does. They say that these women's rights initiatives are a Western conspiracy. They've been brought in here to eradicate Islam and eradicate family values. And when Sedor was used to heighten the age of marriage from 16 to 18, or was it 15 to 18, the Hizb ut-Tahrir rallied against this, saying that Sedor heightening this marriage age, legal age to 18, was against their understanding of Islam and family values, and Sedor was being used as an imperialistic tool to eradicate Islam in Palestine. And that's hugely damaging for the progress of women's rights. And the women's rights organizations live in terror of Hizb ut-Tahrir because they threaten their organizations all the time. And Palestinian women often make the statement that Hizb ut-Tahrir is using Islam against women's rights, but they are Muslim too, and their understanding of women's rights is in tandem with their Islam, and that it's not this Western imperialism. And it's worrying that she sounds the same as Hizb ut-Tahrir in this instance.
I guess it comes back to the point of interpretation, and is one person's interpretation more valid, like so valid to the extent that you can apply it to all women across an entire country, which is quite alarming when you think about it, because the way that I practice Islam is not necessarily the way that many other women practice Islam. And there may be certain things that I do that other women don't, or certain things that I don't do that other women do, but then that's our essential freedom, isn't it? And I don't think that it's because I'm Western that I value my freedom to be able to choose to what extent I practice a religion. So I find that interesting. And I also picked up on her idea of universal values that she mentioned in chapter 2, and she was, as you said, she was mentioning that it's quite Western orientated, and made it sound as though the West is trying to push their idea of values onto the rest of the world. But when you think about it, nobody's actually being forced to apply values. It's just the idea that certain things should be a part of women's rights, like universally. And I think it's interesting that she would argue that maybe it's not necessarily a good thing, because surely rights are rights. They shouldn't have a country attached to them. They shouldn't be like a certain label attached to the West or the East. If something is good for people, then it should be an option no matter where you are, and it shouldn't be that one side of the world is pushing it upon another side, because the whole nature of rights is that it's not being forced upon you, it's just a freedom.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's through and through on every layer. These conventions that countries can sign up to are not forced upon the countries to sign up to them. Also, it's not forced upon the countries to incorporate the convention into their legislation. They are monitored for the level to which they then implement the convention, and they are given guidance on how to do better. And it's a working model working together towards that end that the country voluntarily signs up to. You could say there are soft pushes towards that, as for example, Palestine is very inclined to sign up to anything the UN offers because it wants to be recognized as a state. So you could say it's not entire free will, because it's signing up to these conventions because it wants to be considered more legitimate. It's interesting, just this morning on the news, let me remind myself of her name, a Turkish Brit who is discussing the fact that Istanbul is leaving the Istanbul Convention. Turkey is leaving the Istanbul Convention. So they signed it in and ratified it in 2011. It's a human rights treaty that had women's rights elements. And on March 21st, so just 2 days ago, they left it for the reason that it undermines family values by increasing divorce rates, is what they've said. So Sarah Tor, the Turkish British lady, said, how dare they even begin to think about blaming a women's rights treaty for high divorce rates, rather than considering that this convention is enabling women to escape abusive relationships. Of course, there'll be a higher divorce rate, and rightly so. But it's interesting, she, as a Turkish woman, is very against this idea that the Women's Rights Convention has gone against sort of traditional Islamic family values, and was very for the signing of this treaty. But I can imagine, I haven't looked further, but I can imagine that the debate against the treaty will be very similar to the debate in Palestine, and will be being held by the similarly minded, ideologically aligned individuals, that it is not surprising under Erdogan.
Well, exactly. I think that anything that's it's really interesting what you say about the divorce rates and the potential that this will prevent people from getting divorced. But actually, divorce is not necessarily a bad thing when a woman is trying to leave, for example, marital rape situations, or situations where she's being abused by her husband, or maybe she was pushed into a marriage, or and
how laughable is it to think divorce is such a serious process to go through. You're dividing your life, your home, your family. How laughable is it to think that suddenly, since being protected from domestic abuse and being empowered to leave terrible marriages, suddenly women are going, oh, I'm just going to leave for another man. Oh, here I go. I'm just going to leave my family. I can have a divorce now. It's absolutely laughable that that is what's going on. Divorce will be hugely difficult for their social circles, family, finances, safety.
Well, exactly. And I also, from meeting other because there's implications that she may not find another husband, because unfortunately in many cultures, a woman who's been married before is seen as somebody who's used goods in a way, and it's very difficult for somebody to accept a woman who's already been married and divorced, because there's maybe this notion that something's wrong with her, or her husband saw something that he didn't like about her. And it's definitely not something easy that a woman decides to do. So if there is an increase in divorces, I would suggest it's probably not because she has just decided, oh, there is another man, I'll go and find him, he looks better than the first one. And it's much more likely to be that she's in a really difficult situation and she needs to get out. It's not just a case of, okay, these universal values, we're trying to make the Middle East into a mini America. That's not, I don't think, the aim at all. It's just trying to prevent the horrific things that she goes on to mention in chapter 3.
And the thing is, that's why I think we're left a bit confused by chapter 2 and 3, is she's making the point that we shouldn't have a global effort for women's rights because it's colonialist. But she can't help, because the facts are right in your face, she can't help but make the very sad point that it's desperately needed. You make the argument that these things are Western, then you're being very insulting towards the Middle East, the Middle East cultures. Are you saying leave them to barbarically kill their women because that's their gig?
No,
that seems like that could be where you take her conclusion. If you say, oh, the universal women's rights standards are Western, then you say that what are you saying the Middle Eastern standards are?
Well, exactly. And
I think that's probably our overall conclusion for chapters 2 and 3, is that it was quite confusing, left me feeling very convinced of the need for global women's rights, left me feeling convinced that a multiculturalist approach where we believe that certain cultures have their own practices and shouldn't be intervened with, and that for those from outside the culture to have any intervention is a negative thing. I've come away thinking that's a terrible approach, and that we should help one another to reduce violence, clearly in our own countries and globally. I disagree with her wholeheartedly that the West does not see its own issues. I think #MeToo and recently the outpouring of grief over Sarah Everard suggests we very much are aware and campaigning and active around our own issues. And we're interested in global issues too. And we do feel a connection to those women, and we do feel a part and a need and a draw to work for women everywhere, and because of being women.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I agree partially on what she was saying about the idea that women from certain cultural backgrounds have been used for political reasons. But I think, as you said, that's not to detract from assistance being sought from outside, the country where the abuse is happening. I think that sometimes you do have to try and help people even if they're not in your own country. If you can see something horrific is happening, as human beings and as members of the human race, we have to step in and try to help. And to say that that's one culture encroaching upon another seems to be a way of trying to preserve what's happening in a way, and it seems to be a way to continue the cycle of abuse. And I think that you need to separate the political from the humanitarian, and it's very important to keep the humanitarian, and it's very important to prevent politicians from using women's issues to further their aims.
Couldn't agree more. It's a book so far that is very one-sided on the debate, lacking nuance, and has made some important key points that around women's issues being manipulated for political ends, but because of the extreme stance she's taking, is completely removing the support for humanitarian aid, as you said. And her book actually makes a perfect case for the necessity to keep going with our humanitarian global efforts. And I think she feeds into a narrative that Islamists are using to tackle these kind of initiatives in other countries, like Hizb ut-Tahrir against the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women in Palestine, and like what we've just seen in Turkey with the removal of their convention supporting women. And she is feeding that narrative, which is hugely disappointing.
Exactly, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I think it's just, again, we just need to make sure that we properly assign assistance where it's needed and prevent essentially human rights abuses from continuing, but do it in the appropriate way and leave out the politics.
Well, thank you, Kate. I think that was a really fruitful discussion, and we've managed to keep it shorter than our previous ones. So listeners, if you want to pose any questions or comment, what do you think about global women's rights? Do you think there is such thing as universal human rights? Or do you think each culture has norms of their own and should not be interfered with? Do let us know. And thank you for listening. Okay. Bye.
Bye.